Hello and welcome to the Civic Tech Innovation Forum and Jamfest. Thank you for joining us from across the globe for this year's conference under the hashtag theme DIY Africa. My name is Lwazi Maseko and I work for the Civic Tech Innovation Network and Jamlab. And today I will be facilitating this fireside chat with Seli Chiam. The session is co-hosted by CTIN and Jamlab, and this fireside chat will be focusing on podcasting in Africa and commercializing a non-profit. Now that we have properly welcomed you, I want to cover a few housekeeping rules. If you can, please share and tweet today's conversation on social media using the hashtag Jamfest Africa 2021 and hashtag DIY Africa. We really want this conversation to be interactive as possible, so please do ask us questions on the Q&A function. Please direct them towards our speaker. Any questions, please just do ask them on the Q&A function. And for comments and queries, please do ask on the chat function. Unfortunately, we don't have French interpretation for this conversation, so we do apologize for that. Just so you are aware, this session is being recorded and will be publicly available on our various platforms in different formats. Joining me today is Seli Chiam, CEO and founder of AQ Studios. Welcome, Seli. Thank you so much for joining you. We're very excited to have you. I'm excited to have this conversation about podcast in Africa. How are you doing today?
Thank you. I'm happy to be here. It's exciting.
So before we just get into this conversation, I actually just want you to tell us a little bit more about AQ Studios and the work that you do there and the types of stories that you guys tell.
Right. So AQ Studios is our podcasting media house that it's based in Nairobi in Kenya. We are a African and Black podcasting company. So all of the podcasts that we make focus on experiences, point of view from the continent and also the diaspora. And we make shows that, Black and African folks can listen to anywhere in the world. So our flagship show is called Afro Queer, which is a documentary style show that really tells the stories of queer Africans on the continent and diaspora. And that was our first show that we produced and one of our most popular shows. We are launching 2 other shows. One is called Adventures from the Bedrooms of African Women, which is an adaptation of a very popular Ghanaian blog. And so the women who started that blog are now hosting a podcast and have been working on that podcast for this last year. We're really excited to launch that show. And then we have our last show, In Search of a Black Planet, which is a Black travel show. So those are our 3 shows, and we have a couple other that we're taking on in 2022. And that's AQ Studios. And we also, we do lots of podcast trainings across the continent. And it's a fantastic team. So I can't take credit because I have a fantastic team that works on all of these things. And so that's who we are. Yeah.
I mean, you mentioned Africa Queer and the types of stories that you write about. Why did you specifically want to focus on queer people living in Africa and the diaspora?
Well, it's because I actually started a nonprofit called None on Records. And I started that nonprofit in 2006. And at that time, I was a journalist working in the United States. And I noticed that, there was a lesbian activist from Sierra Leone who was murdered named Fanny Ann Eddy. And when that happened, it had an impact on me because I'm a West African. I'm a West African who grew up in diaspora. I'm Senegalese. And I had not heard of the queer organizing that was happening in West Africa. It was very, very quiet actually, and very hidden. And when this woman was murdered, it's when I learned what she had been doing and how she had been advocating for the rights of LGBT people in Sierra Leone. So when that happened, I started to travel around, at that time, North America. So I was in the United States. Also, I went to Canada and I started taking first person, stories, interviewing queer Africans who were in diaspora at that time because they were easily accessible to me. And so I was trying to understand what their stories were, what they had experienced on the continent, and what it was like for them to be now immigrants in this new place. And then I traveled to South Africa actually, and had opportunity to interview Bev Dietzy and other people who have been part of the LGBT organizing and activism in South Africa. And from there, I went to West Africa and then eventually to East Africa. And so when I started documenting in East Africa, I also started training activists there to do this work as well, to document stories. And at that time, a group of activists asked if we could open a nonprofit and keep doing this work within Nairobi. And so that's how None on Record became the office, was opened in Kenya in 2012. So that was kind of my history of seeing that there was a lack of stories and wanting to be part of creating and documenting queer African experiences. And from there, establishing a nonprofit to help support documentation on the continent and also by Africans on the continent. That was really important to me, that they were documenting their own stories in their own communities. And then we started Afroqueer, our first podcast, and it blew up. And then we just followed and started doing more podcasting. So it's kind of it's a long way to here, but it's been a very amazing and exciting experience. But I think to answer your question more directly, the reason why we focused on LGBT stories was because, it's what we had been documenting for, at that time, it was almost over 10 years. So it was just a natural progression for that. Yeah.
So, I mean, podcasting is steadily rising in Africa. So how were you able to break into the podcasting space in Africa?
Yeah, so when we started our show, we were really fortunate. The first season was very successful and people really, they really took to the show. So I love people who are listening or watching to definitely listen to Afroqueer wherever they get their podcasts. We do a lot of documentary style work. So it's not necessarily a chat cast, but you're gonna go into an experience. We report it out, we do sound design, those kinds of things. But at that time, after the first season, we won the Google Podcast Creators Program, the incubator program, when they did it the first year. And when that happened, we were put into a very big international, sort of on an international stage and in an international space. And we also, our network grew tremendously. So when that happened, we were really poised to kind of, now be able to support other people who are trying to make podcasts and be part of, supporting the ecosystem on the continent. So when that happened, people started writing us and being like, how do you make a podcast? Can you show us how to make a podcast? What do we need to make a podcast? How do we get money to make a podcast? All the questions that we're going to talk about today. And that's really how we kind of came about. I don't think we set out to do it. It just happened. But now that we're here, it's great to be part of, strengthening the ecosystem for podcasting on the continent. It's one of my favorite mediums, and I think everyone should be doing it. So, so that's kind of what happened there.
I mean, so you mentioned those questions that you guys were receiving from people. So I actually want to ask you, what do you need to start a podcast? Like, when you start a podcast, do you have to have a niche targeted audience? What type of format should you choose? And does the format of the podcast, does it have to complement the content that you produce? So you talk about documentary style content. Does that have to, did you choose that documentary style because of the types of stories you tell?
Well, I think, okay, so to break it down, and I think this list will always grow. There's various types of formats for podcasts. So ours is documentary style because it's what we love to do. A lot of us are journalists and filmmakers and documentarians. So, we naturally will tend to lean towards a documentary style structure for our shows, right? But there's so many fantastic podcasts. There's fiction podcasts now, which are really great. People write scripts and they do, it's like listening to radio drama. It's fantastic. There's chatcasts where people, interview people or they talk. That's a really popular format on the continent. And the reason is because chatcasts are something that you just need a phone for or a mic for. You guys can't see, but I have a whole podcast set up here that I'm pointing to. But like, it's a much lower sort of, in terms of what you need to make a chatcast. It makes sense that that's why people are doing those. And those are also really interesting because they can be really great interview style podcasts, or, you can have a conversation, and those are always really fun to listen to. So there's a lot of different structures in terms of podcasts. And I think, as the audio medium now is, people are really paying attention to the audio medium now. I think other kinds of different, styles of telling stories are going to come out, which is exciting, right? So we chose it because we really like to design our audio in that format, documentary. But in 2022, we're going to actually take on an interview style show, and it'll be the first one that we've produced. So it's just whatever it is you feel like you want to do and how you want to structure your show. And sometimes it's about what you have available, So for Afroqueer, if we're doing a story in Johannesburg and we're in Nairobi, we have to either travel or we have to work with journalists on the ground. There's a lot of interviews, there's a lot of research, there's a lot of fact checking, and those types of podcasts take a lot longer to make, and they can be expensive to make as well. So, I feel like really excited because our 3 shows now are documentary style, and I'm excited to do something that is not documentary style actually, because I think we make probably on average about 8 episodes a season for Afroqueer because they are really time consuming. And they're fantastic, but they take time. So that means we can't make a 12 episode season sometimes, or a 22 episode season, or sometimes some of your favorite podcasts, it'll be like episode 157. That'd be a dream, but like, so it's a lot of things that you have to think about when you're going into making a podcast. And I think sometimes people underestimate how much work it is to actually produce a podcast. That's the other thing. Yeah.
I mean, since it is a documentary style, how do you retain the attention of audiences?
Yeah, I think, it's always about good storytelling, good writing, good sound design is always going to win your audience. And, I think my team, they know that I'll come in and be like, this is too long. You have to cut it. You got to cut it down, or, when you listen to a story, sometimes you have to think about the pacing, and, you have to sometimes what we call kill your darlings. Like, yes, you want to keep this in there, but it slows down the momentum of the show. So once it's all about good storytelling. It's also about good story editing, and learning how to listen to cut actually, which is something that you definitely learn over time. You start to learn to listen to cut. So some of your first things you'll listen to, and you can go back a year later and be like, oh, okay, we maybe needed to take that out. That didn't need to be there. And the more you do the medium, the better you're going to get at it, and you're going to start to get sharper and quicker. So that's how we approach it. And we have a team that, I listen to it last, but, we go through a series. So the reporters who have been working on it and the producers who have been working on it, they can't always hear it because they've been in a story for, a few months. They hand it to the story editor. The story editor is now listening to it, and it's the first time she's heard it. So she's like, I don't understand this, or this is too long here. And they do another cut. And then it comes to me, and then I listen to it, and then I'll have a bunch of questions. So I try not to listen until it gets to me. For that reason. So we're very fortunate that we have a team that can go through this process. But sometimes for a new show, we sent it out to just people we really trust. We're like, listen to this show. What do you think? And they give you an honest opinion. And that's what you want. You want your audience to give you an honest opinion about your show. So.
So for people who are starting out, who want to start a podcast, what actually makes a great story? Because I mean, you're talking about storytelling and saying that that's how you retain audiences. So what makes your story good enough to make people come back to your podcast and listen to your episodes?
That's such a tough question, because I'm like, okay, how can I answer that question? So I was, and to be completely transparent, I'm a trained journalist, and I went to my undergraduate degree is in writing and fiction writing. So a lot of my education and in my professional life was always about story and crafting story for audience. So to me, it's really about practice, right? So like if you tell a friend a good story, when they're listening and when they're not. You know what I'm saying? When they're not. When they checked out. So I can say in education, like what I learned was always the hero's journey for a story, right? So you start by stating the conflict. So it's like dun 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 dun, like, and then the person who is the storyteller at this point is going to have to go through some kind of journey that's going to put them right in the middle of the conflict at the top, and then there has to be a resolution, right? So that's like the classical sense of how you structure, a story. And you can think about that in fiction and films that you watch and documentary. You always are taking people on a journey. So you're always taking someone through something that's complicated. And then there's somehow a resolution, whether it's good or bad or not, there's always something that kind of makes this arc. When you're thinking about that in a documentary style podcast, that makes sense. When you're thinking about it in terms of like a chat cast or something where someone's being interviewed, you still kind of have to have that same thought process. Like, what's going to make people sit down and listen to this person talk for 40 minutes? It's because this person has gone through something or has some information or some kind of experience that's going to make you understand your life even more, right? So when you're thinking about story, you're always thinking about, if I'm a listener coming into this experience, how am I going to go away transformed in some very small or some very big way? That's always how you have to approach it if a story is strong enough, right? And I think we so naturally as people are always being told stories that we don't realize that we have the formula already. It's just now we have to remember it. We have to remember, like, what made this thing that I love so much, this movie I love and watch over and over, what makes this thing good? And when you understand that, that's really kind of the natural storytelling structure. And as Africans, we are great storytellers. So we just do it. And it's something that we do very, very inherently. But, and if we break it down, it's pretty much that hero's journey sort of structure for everything, really. Yeah.
I think before I just ask you the next question, I do want to encourage the attendees, to ask Sally as much questions as you want. I mean, she is here. Just ask her about podcasting and her experience. That would be really great. But I just want to ask, I mean, in terms of podcasting, how do you think it's changing the media landscape in Africa?
I think it's starting to gain momentum. We're seeing mobile carriers thinking about creating podcast networks, which I was like, wow, that's fantastic. We'll see how that works as it goes along, but that's really great. Spotify is now on the continent, whereas before it wasn't, and that's going to change things for people in terms of, like, how they listen. So I think where we are now is that people are making podcasts, people are listening to podcasts, people are listening to audiobooks, people, they listen to podcasts on YouTube. Like, everything is happening in this medium. I think where we're going to go next is we're going to have to figure out how to distribute it ourselves, right? So there's Spotify, there's Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, there's all of these great platforms. I think what's going to take it to the next level even is when we start to develop ways that we can actually distribute our work to our own targeted audiences, right? But I think we're in a state where it's not as new as it was even 2 years ago, but it hasn't hit that peak just yet, right? So this is a great time for people who are listening to get into the podcasting game. This is the ground floor. This is the beginning. And I think it's also really important to utilize a lot of these big companies that are also doing podcasting. Like, in the US, there's so much going on with podcasting. Netflix is starting a podcast. Amazon is podcasting. Like, it's something that, as it grows in the US, it's gonna, this is how the dynamic works. It'll grow all over the world. So this is that point where now we get to explore and figure out how podcasting can work in our individual countries, in our region, and continent wide, before it has an explosion where it's going to be even harder to get in there. So start podcasting. Everybody start podcasting.
Okay, so you're encouraging everybody to start their own podcast, but I mean, what would make somebody, like, if I want to start my own podcast, what would make me different to everybody else? Because I mean, everybody's starting it. So you want people to listen to it, but what would make my podcast stand out? Like what tips could you give to people to be like, these are the things that could make you stand out?
I totally understand your question. I mean, it's tough for me because when I start any projects that I'm working on, it's something I care about, and I know that, like, for me, when we started Afroqueer, it was something that was really important to me. It was important to my team. We didn't go into it thinking, are people going to listen to this? We were thinking we're going to make something really beautiful, and something that is important to us, and we're going to put it in the world so that people have access to it wherever they are, and maybe it'll mean something to them, right? And it did. I think sometimes it's so difficult because we are in such a consumer kind of driven, sort of thinking about the media that we make. Like, how do we stand out? How do we get listeners? How do we do these things, which are really important? So at some point you got to get some people in to help you do that. But in the beginning, you have to make something that is important to you, right? If it's important to you, it's going to be important to someone else, right? And I think it's really, sometimes you have to approach projects that way, because that's when you're going to get that authentic voice. You can do a commercial project too. We could do a podcast with a very famous person, and a bunch of people are going to listen to it, and it's still going to matter to people. But when we're talking about being an unknown producer, or someone who's working with a small group of people, or you're just trying to get in, make something that matters to you, right? It matters to your team. And I can't stress that enough, because there's no way it's hard to make content. And people who are producers, people who are independent filmmakers, people who do anything entrepreneurial, you know how hard it is to start something and to keep going. You get burned out. You don't know if people are actually, listening. You don't know if people are buying into it. And the one thing that's going to keep you going is if it matters to you. Okay. So I think it's really important to approach it that way. And when you put your heart into something, it will stand out, because they'll feel that. So I want to make sure that we don't get away from the human connection of storytelling. That is the basis of all of our work as journalists, as producers, as content creators. That's we're trying to connect with other people. So you have to do that well. You have to do that very authentically, if that makes sense. Yeah.
Okay, so you talk about people having to, have a passion, something that they're interested in. I have a passion, I have an interest in this topic, but how do I package it? How do I bring it together and actually make it become a podcast?
Okay, so I think one of the first things is to figure out how you want to tell the story. So if I know that there's an interesting person who has a fantastic story, and I want people to know it because I know it, and it's like powerful, right? So I sit and I go, okay, let me interview. So I get them in studio, and we just have a conversation, interview. And, from that, I can do it a couple ways. I can make it into a chat cast. I can say, hey, it's Sally Chum. I'm talking to, this person, and, they have this great story, and I can cut it that way. I could cut it sort of like a storytelling documentary style, where I take myself out. I'm taking the raw tape, and I'm cutting it so that people are kind of following this person tell this narrative story. And there's some amazing audio work that does that, and that's an incredible structure for a podcast. So it really is just, sometimes it's always about the strength of what the structure is going to do to support the actual story, right? Not everything needs to be documentary style, and some things don't need to be chat cast, and some things maybe need to be fiction. So what you do at this point is you sit down and you think, what's the best way for me to tell this story? And then you also have to think, what limitations do I have? Can I travel? Can I do sound design? If you can't, then it kind of shapes how you're going to tell the story. And I can't stress this enough. We do a documentary style. That style has, been passed down from a lot of American shows, like This American Life, Invisibilia, which is one of my favorite podcasts. And that was kind of the standard for podcasting for a very long time. but that's not the only way to make a podcast. And I just want to encourage people who are getting into this to not, I know you hear these really rich shows, but they have teams, they have budgets, they have a lot of things. Don't feel like you have to do it that way, because there are powerful shows where they are interview shows, right? And they transform people all the time, hearing other people. So I think it's important to sit down and figure out what's going to work for you, how you're going to get this done, and how you're going to get it out. It's a creative process, like everything.
So we have a question here from Ruwana. She's asking, do you work with independent producers?
Yeah, that's a great question. We do work with independent producers, actually. We're in production now. We've always worked with independent producers. We get pitches often for our shows from people, and we ask the audience for pitches often. So some of our best episodes have been pitches from the audience. And even if people don't have radio experience, audio experience, or media experience, we'll actually work with them. They come in as producers on the episode that they pitch, and then we create it. But we love working with people who are already producers too. And so, yeah, a couple for season 4 were pitched to us by independent producers, which is great. Yeah.
Okay, so you decided to monetize your podcast. So
Yep.
for people who are trying to do it, like, firstly, why did you decide to do it? Like, what led to the change?
For monetization? Well, it was because we needed to think about sustainability. As I said earlier, I started an NGO. So a lot of what we were doing for the first 2 seasons of AfroQueer, and even now, we got a lot of grant support for that. And that was amazing, because we were able to then really be creative and not worry about if we could pay to produce the show, because it was, we had the money to produce the show. But thinking forward, I was like, okay, how are we going to produce these shows? What happens if the grant money runs out? We need to figure out how to monetize. And so we had a lot of conversations with podcasters in different spaces from the US, from the UK, from other places. In Brazil, we talked to a lot of podcasters, and we were trying to understand how they were monetizing in their prospective regions, or their countries. And the big thing that was at that time was that everybody was like, we're still trying to figure out how to monetize. Like, no one had figured it out. Everyone was like, it's difficult to monetize something that has been given away for free for so long. Because, as you know, if you have an iPhone, or, the iPhone comes with Apple Podcasts, right? So if you have Android, sometimes you get Stitcher. I think Stitcher is maybe like $1 or something a month. I don't remember. I have an iPhone, I'm not gonna lie, but I know that you do sometimes have to pay for the Android apps, and some are free. But it was always just like something that was given away for free, that now we were trying to figure out how to monetize. Like, can you do a paywall? And then people would just stop listening. Okay, that's not gonna work. How do we do this? So I think over the last couple of years, it started to become clearer how to monetize, but it's not a perfect formula yet. And it changes depending on where you are.
I mean, what are some of the strategies what are some of the strategies you guys use to monetize your content? So how can one make money with their podcast?
Yes. So we do a sponsorship. So each of our shows, actually, and because we created a show. So I just want to be really transparent and honest with everyone. If AfroQueer hadn't done as well as it did, it would be really difficult for us to monetize now. Okay. So AfroQueer did really well. It got a huge audience, and a lot of press. So when that happened, it meant that people wanted to now sponsor AfroQueer, right? So once they sponsored AfroQueer, that was also part. So at this time also, we still had grant support for the show, but now we were getting money that we hadn't even considered, because people wanted to sponsor the show. So that was one way. Another thing people say is, or so when we say people, or we're talking about organizations, and we're talking about companies, okay? They want to sponsor the show. So in that regard, they'll say something like, I'm just going to throw an arbitrary figure. So this is not a figure that anyone should write down as the figure. But let's say someone says, okay, we want to give you $5,000 to help, we want to sponsor parts of AfroQueer. So, $5,000 in terms of the larger budget for the season of AfroQueer is it's nice though. We will not say no to that, especially if our values align with that sponsor. And what that means is that, in various episodes, we'll take a break and we'll say some things, or, be like, this is brought to you by blah, 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 blah. We put them at the end of the show, those kinds of things. So for AfroQueer, sometimes we can get up to 6 sponsors, and when that happens, that means that I can bring on another editor. I can help to give, the producers a raise. I can we have a bigger travel budget. We can do a better show, right? So that's how that works. The other thing that people want to talk about is advertising dollars. Advertising dollars are they're extremely complicated. I don't think, especially when you're first starting out and you still have a small listenership, advertising dollars is a very small amount of money. So sometimes you have to get up into the hundreds of thousands of downloads to even see, $100, from advertisers. So I think everyone should have that in their pocket, know how it works, but that's not necessarily going to be the thing that's going to get you paid for just when you first start out. Okay. So those are the kind of the first two that we're talking about. So what we've done is a bit of a different kind of structure. So we have sponsorships. We are in this next couple of seasons. We do have advertisement dollars now. We also are doing some IP shares. So we've been approached to take some of our shows and put them to Netflix or Hulu or wherever. So we get approached by, production companies that I want to adapt the show. And so I also want to really encourage everyone who's producing things to understand how valuable your IP is, okay? And to guard that, because that is literally that is very valuable. That's like one of the most valuable things you have. So with AfroQueer, if we decide to move forward with some of these projects, what we end up doing is, for the year, we will actually sell the IP for the show to someone who wants to produce it for Netflix. Once that happens, then we also negotiate what happens after it goes onto Netflix, right? And so that is something that I think podcasters have to start to understand is going to be a lot of what's going to be happening next. A lot of these interviews that you put out in the world, a lot of this content that you put out in the world, people need ideas to make other content. So I always think about podcasts as one part of the storytelling structure and one part of the medium, but you're going to be able to take that podcast and make a lot of other different things. So that's the other ways that we also are now making money, which is really fantastic. So all the different shows also they do live shows. I personally hate selling t-shirts, but we actually do really well on swag. I don't handle that part. That's another way that we make money, but we structured it so for now, as we grow, because we're in a growth phase and we're also hiring. So any producers out there, please go to our website, apply for that job. While we're in this growth phase, we have a hybrid structure where we have grant funding, and now we're getting revenue and income from the shows in various ways. So it's the structure is not totally for profit, but it's not for profit yet either. And that's actually kind of a good sweet spot too, because so for example, we're now taking investments for our for-profit production house. And what that means is that, if someone comes to us and says, okay, we want to give you $200,000 to help you grow your company, they have equity. They own a little bit of our company now too. Which is something that you should never enter in lightly, right? It's something that you need sometimes to grow, but you always got to think about what it means to give a little bit of your company away for a set amount of money, right? But it's part of how this system is designed, is part of how it works. So it's not something that you should completely reject, but you definitely have to consider it. But having a structure where you can still take grant funding, which means that this is in some regards free money. You're still accountable to it, but it's money that you can use to grow, opposed to money for investment, which is more of equity. So you don't have as much flexibility. And if you're crashing and burning, they can come in and do whatever. So I know this is like kind of high level stuff, but I'm hoping that it's useful for people to think about moving forward.
So we have 3 questions here. I hope I'm pronouncing your name correctly. It's Simpra, who's asking, what would you say made AfroQueer so popular that it was able to garner sponsors and funders?
Okay. I think it was the style of storytelling. We really worked very hard to make it something that was very sound rich and, beautiful. We worked really, really hard on that. I think at the time too, there was no show that was really highlighting the experiences of queer Africans. So we basically filled a niche without realizing it. And so a lot of times this was the first time people were hearing about some of these stories. And we wanted to make sure, it was really important to us that it wasn't the obvious kinds of stories like, oh, we're being persecuted. No, like, yes, we're being persecuted for sure. But it's very important to tell stories where you have a complexity of experiences. And we really wanted to do something where even when queer Africans were listening to it, they would be like surprised. You know what I mean? And that's why it got to be so popular. It's a well done show. And I'm not just saying it because I'm on the producing team, but it was a very well done show. And it also told stories that people hadn't heard before. So that's why, I think, for sure.
We have a second one from Unuguzola, who's asking, how do you guard the IP of a podcast?
Okay, so any kind of agreements that you have with any producers who approach you and say, I'd really like to take your podcast and make it into a film. That happens to us quite a bit, actually. Don't just say yes, of course. Make sure there's contracts involved. Read the contracts. If you can afford a lawyer, have a lawyer read the contracts. And also, it's really important to know what it is you want out of these situations. Okay, so sometimes when you're producing and you don't have access to a lot of resources, when someone comes, they might give you something that is not really, your IP is worth so much more, but you're in a position where you really need that money, basically. Don't do it. That's all I can say. Just make sure to take your time with any kind of contractual stuff and legal stuff when it comes to your content. Once you put it into the world, it belongs to you. Okay, so that is that. But when you're talking about taking your IP and making it to something else, that's when you have to be really careful and you have to be really sure. You got to make sure that contract works for you, right? And also just be okay to say, no, we need to make these terms better, okay? Because they wouldn't be coming to you if your idea wasn't spectacular. They want that idea. So you are in a very good bargaining position moving forward. Yeah.
I just want to ask, like, based on that question, just when you're working with, because you mentioned like Hulu and Netflix, and developing your podcast, how, like, what is the creative process that you have? Is that also part of the contract that you guys discuss, that this is the amount that you can do? Like, what is actually the process of doing it?
Yeah. So for example, we can negotiate it where for the next, if our podcast goes on to Netflix, Hulu, a streaming service, that we're now executive producers of that show, right? So that's something that's really important, because what it does is it creates an ability for us, no matter what show we make next, to be like, this is our track record executive producing content for this. So you always want to negotiate something to think through, how are you going to get to the next level of what it is you're trying to do, right? And so that executive producer credit is really, really important to us to make sure that we have it. For something like Afro Queer for Adaptation, I definitely want my producers to be in the room, right? So if they're writing for for TV or whatever, we need to be in the room. We have to be part of the writing process. We have to support and help. And we also have to know when we need some step aside, because we're not necessarily always, we're not TV people 100%. So it's also about collaboration. And then of course there's the financial aspects of the contracts. But you don't ever want to take a contract and not have legal support, So if a company approaches us to buy our IP, the first thing I do is send it to our business lawyer, right? Because I can't always understand legalese. So she'll take it and she'll be like, so this means that, if you have a disagreement about this, it doesn't matter, because they're going to be able to do it anyway. And I'll be like, okay, we need to change the terms of that, because that's not going to work. So it's also really important that you have support before you sign these things, so you understand what it is that you're getting into. But as I said before, it's also important to know what you want from the situation. Like I said, I want us to make sure we have an executive producer title. I want to make sure that our producers are in the writing room. I want to make sure that, we have a ability to dispute or to have some conflict and mediation if something is being told in a way that we find really problematic. So these are things that are important to us. It's important that what those things are. Some people, they sign contracts and they just it's, you know, it's done. They just give it over and they have no say in what they're doing. But you can figure out what you want and you can make those terms work.
So I have another question from Ruwana. She's asking, do producers have to be based in Kenya?
No, they do not have to be based in Kenya. So currently we have our core team, which is based in Kenya. And then we have producers working out of London. We have producers working out of Accra. We have producers working out of Lagos. We've worked with producers working out of Johannesburg. You know, for one of our shows, one of our producers is based in Washington, D.C. So we are a global entity. What really matters to us is the stories that are being told. And we know that Black and African people live all over the world. So, you know, we're very, very good with working with people who are not based necessarily and where we're registered as a company. Yeah.
I have another question from Ayanda, who's asking, do you have any recommendations about choosing hosts for a chat cast? Is it better to have one person at the helm or more than one?
That's a great question. I think it's always about chemistry. You know, because if you think of some of the most popular shows, sometimes it's just like, you know, especially morning shows. Morning shows, I think, are like some of the best chat cast structure because it's all about, you know, it's all about high energy, keeping people awake, getting them to their job, making them feel excited to have to get up that early. You know, morning shows are always about chemistry. You know, they're about, so if you're going to have more than one host, you have to make sure they have a lot of great chemistry. And that, you know, you can find a way to write that out sometimes, because even some of that, like seeming off of the cuff stuff, that's stuff that they've practiced. You know, it's always just about making it feel like it's so spontaneous, but it's stuff that they practiced for sure. I think it also just depends on what's like your tone in terms of your chat cast. If it's going to be something that's really, you know, upbeat, funny, then you're going to have to get that kind of personality to carry the show. There's also a lot of chat casts that have a little bit more of a somber and more, you know, serious tone. So you're going to pick someone who can carry it that way. So I think it's always just about tone and chemistry in terms of chat casts, and you're going to be good. You're going to be good to go.
In terms of the tone, is with your podcast, your episodes, does it have to all follow the same tone, or could you have like different types of tone? Could the style of storytelling change in each episode, or does it have to be consistent across all the episodes?
I think that's a good question too. I think there's some things, especially for Afroqueer, where we're like, oh, this is an Afroqueer episode, because it has, you know, this formula that we do like. For season 4, though, we are doing some episodes with fiction where some writers have come on, and that's an entire episode. And that's something that we had been thinking about when we started, but we hadn't had an opportunity to really look at that. And that's, you know, that's really amazing to have, you know, a queer African writer be able to like read their story or get actors. We're doing a lot of stuff with voice actors right now. For season 4. And that's going to be a little bit different from what we've done in the past 3 seasons, but it's still going to feel like an Afroqueer episode. You know, our last episode that we published was about the bisexual king of Uganda, you know, back in the 1800s. And for that one, we had to do some really cool sound design because we were telling a story from the past. And, you know, we couldn't interview him because he's, you know, long gone. So what we were doing was we had to do a ton of research, or the producers who did that episode had to do a ton of research. And then they had to recreate scenes with like sound effects. And they had to do all these kinds of really cool things. And I think that was the first time we did something like that. If I remember. Oh, no, we did it a little bit too with an episode from Morocco. But you know, as you grow, you start to really sort of take what you have, you know, what's working so far, and then you kind of grow, you know, you start to do more creative things. And I think that's the fun of making anything. But I think that core of how you tell a story will always still be there. So people will recognize it when they hear it.
Okay, so you obviously mentioned like using sound effects for the podcast episode about the bisexual king. I mean, are there other types of things that you use to compensate for the lack of visuals to keep people interested?
Yeah. So there's sound design. You know, we always get nat sounds, you know, so I know there's a couple of times where Ida's been like, I'm here at the stadium, you know, and then you get the sounds of the stadium. You know, or if we're you know, in a car, like, you know, you get the sounds of driving, you get the sounds of the street. So we always have to remember with audio, especially documentary style audio, that it does have layers that keep people, because you can't always write it out, people have to hear it, you know, they have to feel immersed. So we do a lot of sound design in that regard. And, you know, nat sound is like, for filmmakers out there, it's like B-roll. Like, you can't make a documentary without B-roll. I mean, you could, but you shouldn't. So it's like our B-roll is nat sound, collecting sounds as we go. And then we layer them all. And then music is very important. And so we do a lot of things with music as well.
Okay, so you obviously talk about sound. So sometimes, you know, when you're listening to something will sound like really loud on your phone versus just like listening to your phone or listening on different like audio types. Like, do you take that into consideration as well? Like type of like, yeah, like loudness.
Yeah, we do. I mean, we haven't always been 100% perfect, but no one really is in this regard. But yeah, we will publish. Now, at that time, the producers then listen to it on like headphones, or, you know, some people are listening to it Bluetooth to their car. So we know early in the first season, we kind of knew what different sounds, how it sounded through different kinds of players. But there is also, with our editor, there's a standard broadcast. I don't want to say frequency, but sort of like loudness, or terms of how he mixes, that there's a standard that he has to hit so that it works. And then when we're listening to it in headphones or whatever, we can tell him to go up or to go down. We'll give him feedback. But generally now we know what it is. We know exactly where he needs to hit it after doing it for a year. That's also something that requires practice, and it'll get easier over time. I can say that a lot to people. But listen to your show on different devices, for sure. Listen to it on your computer, listen to it on your headphones, listen to it in your car, listen to it on your phone speaker, because that gives you a sense of how other people are experiencing it in different ways.
Okay, so you're based in the US and then you work in Africa, work with people and living in Africa. So what are the differences between podcasting in Africa versus in the US? And what are some of the lessons that we can take away living in Africa?
So I'm based in Kenya. I know this accent, everybody gets so confused. I'm in the US now because COVID separated me from my family for a year and a half. So I came home to be with them because, you know, all my nieces and nephews were like 2 feet taller, and it was just, I was really sad. So I came home for a little bit. But I actually, our main office is based out of Nairobi, out of Kenya. And so, but to your question, I was raised here in the US, and I did a lot of my education here in the US, and I worked as a journalist here in the US. I was a radio journalist, and I also produced podcasts in the US before I left to be 100% established in Kenya. So that's just for clarity's sake. So I know a lot about the ecosystem of podcasting here in the US as well, because it's what I was trained. I think the main difference right now is that we don't necessarily have our own distribution platforms that are very strong. That's one of the big issues. Another big challenge, and when I say distribution platforms, I'm talking about like Apple Podcasts, I'm talking about Spotify, I'm talking about, and I know companies like MTN and Safaricom are trying to, create podcasting, distribution models within their mobile carriers for when you buy data, or if you get a phone, it'll come up as an app, which I think is great. It's a fantastic idea. We'll see how the implementation works. And I think there's also something like that in South Africa too, which I think is really, really cool. So that's one of our bigger challenges. The other thing is that monetization wise, it's very difficult for sometimes. So what happens is a lot of independent producers will be approached to produce a podcast for, say an NGO or, a corporation, on the continent. That happens to us also quite often. The challenge is that people often don't want to pay for that work, so I think this is a great challenge we have across the continent in terms of as creative people and as artists, as people who make content, we're not always paid appropriately for our labor. So that's also another challenge that we're having now, where we have to sort of set a standard to say, this is how much it's going to cost to produce this podcast, big corporation, and you need to pay it. So that's also another big challenge. I think in terms of access to resources to actually produce, really like more complicated content that isn't a chat cast, that there's a huge vacuum there. So I think people would create more complex sound stuff if people had resources to do so. And so there's another thing where I think a lot of new grants and new things are coming up to help people produce this content, because it is, as I said, people underestimate how much it costs to make really complicated documentary style shows. And they underestimate how much of their time is going to have to go into producing this. So I think that's where some of the challenges are, but I don't think that necessarily isn't a challenge in the United States either. I just think in the US there's more opportunity for monetization. It's still a challenge, but I think the structures that we need for sustainability on the continent are still being developed. I think that's how I can say it. So for us, if I could, I would move AQ Studios completely for profit. It's not possible yet, because we have to still have a mixed funding structure, so that, I can utilize a lot of this grant funding to support the development of the for-profit structure, right? And the development of the team, right? So it's challenging. I want to be transparent. Like, if there's no quick and easy in this, I think a lot of podcasters that you meet on the continent who have gotten farther along, they'll probably tell you the same thing. Like, we're all constantly trying to figure out how to monetize. And a lot of times we get to work together to set a standard, which is really great. And I would encourage that more often. Like, we need to be working more together. So if I'm going to charge, said the UN, $15,000 to do this, you shouldn't come in and be like, I'm going to charge them $4,000. You know what I'm saying? Like, let's sort of make a standard for ourselves. So that's kind of where we are.
How much does it actually cost to produce an episode?
People ask that question quite often. It really depends. We have spent sometimes a boatload of money on one episode, with travel. But it's also because we had that money to spend, So I think what I can say to that is that there's not necessarily, there comes a point where your budget numbers start to change depending on how much access you have to resources. Okay. But what you definitely need to start is your equipment. So, you can get the entry kit. I think there's great podcasting kits that you can get for like $200, $300 US. So I'm doing it in US dollars. I'm sorry. It's just like the one currency I think we can all just we can translate, but so that $300, for us, if we're trying to buy this equipment in Kenya, it's going to now be maybe $500, and so what we do is we actually bring a lot of our equipment in from, like New York, or even the shipping costs are cheaper than if we were to actually buy it in country. So those are the kinds of things that I can explain in terms of budget. Your software, you can use free software, or you can, buy software. Just that kind of stuff is going to always be your set costs. When it comes to now producing it, it depends on if you have a budget, because I always want to encourage people to think about always how they're going to pay themselves eventually, right? But, it always is about your time. Do you have money to pay yourself? Do you have the resources to, if you need to license music, we pay roughly about, I want to say, Tevin should be on here. He has the number. I think we pay roughly about $300 a year to license music from a licensing service that solely does podcasting. However, sometimes we want to feature artists. And so we license directly from specific artists and make sure that we pay them. So that's also another budget line. If you are going to have producing team, if you're going to work on a show for 6 months, you got to think about your salary line. So I think what we want to start with always is like what the physical things you need in order to make the podcast. And that's where you can start to think about your money. And then you have to start to think about your time and labor and all these other different things, licensing and distribution, which is free. You can actually publish SoundCloud, you can publish and it'll do an RSS feed straight to Apple Podcasts for you. So there's ways to cut so that you don't have to spend money on that as well. I hope that answers your question. I feel like it's a bit of a complicated formula, but
Yeah, I mean, it does. I just also wanted to ask, is it necessary to have high tech in order to start a podcast?
No, you can record a podcast on your phone. We're actually going to release a bunch of videos for that. So be on the lookout before the end of the year about how to record a podcast on your phone and how to use free software to edit it. What you want to do, though, is always think about the room in which you're recording. So, if you do have the access to like a garage and a car, cars are actually soundproof. So if you record, well, to a point, but they do still out sound usually. So you can record in a car. You can also record in a closet, these kinds of things. But you just want to think about where you're recording so that the quality of the recording, if you're using your phone, is still going to be good enough for people to listen to, right? So the thing is, you always want to think about people listening. People listening to, are they going to be able to listen to this? Is there going to be background noise that's going to be super distracting? So you do want to think about where you're recording. That's a really important thing.
I mean, we're coming to an end, and I think before we end, I just want to ask, where do you see the future of podcasting in Africa?
I feel like it's already blowing up. I see it becoming a serious industry on the continent. I think people are, we have so much, mobile phone, we're going to say mobile phone penetration, but I mean, people are using mobile phones all over the continent. And I think that's going to be one of the places where people are going to start to utilize, audio content, if it's audiobooks, if it's podcasts, whatever. So I know that it's gonna blow up. I think where we are growing in terms of, as it grows, we need to think about monetization, equity and pay, those kinds of things. And those are the things that are going to be coming up within the next couple of years, as people like us who make content, they need us to put that content on their things. so that's where the next big thing is going to start to happen. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Sally. I mean, I personally learned a lot, and I'm not even a podcaster, so I hope the attendees have also learned so much. Thank you so much for your insights. We really were excited to have you, and thank you so much for just joining us and just giving us your experience and insights into podcasting in Africa and the future of podcasting in Africa.
Well, thank you for having me. It's been a blast. I love talking about this. And I hope next year we can all see each other in person, right?
Well, hopefully, yeah.
Imagine this in person. It'd be so great. But thank you so much for putting this together. I mean, this has just been such a fantastic, digital conference. I don't know how we describe it, but I was really happy to be here. So thank you. I enjoyed it.
Thank you. And I just want to remind our attendees, don't forget to join us later this evening for our exhibition hangouts. Visit our website for more details. Ladies and gentlemen, that's all we have for today. Thank you to Sally for joining us, and thank you for your insights. And we really do hope that you enjoyed it. And thank you to our attendees.
Sisi wenyewe ni mashujaa.
Nous sommes nos propres héros.
We are our own heroes.
Power to the innovators, the DIYers across the continent.
Power to you who push the doors wide open.
Power to you who've planted good seed on fertile African ground. We celebrate you. Thank you for joining us. Visit our websites and social media platforms to continue the conversation.